Imagine this: Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Holocaust, the face of one of the most horrific regimes in history, once smiled warmly at a little girl, held her close, and called her his sweetheart. And that girl had Jewish ancestry. It sounds impossible, unbelievable, but it's true. And for years, their bizarre, haunting friendship was captured in photographs, letters, and shared moments, while the world around them was crumbling under the weight of Nazi ideology. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Bernile Nienau, the Jewish child Adolf Hitler once embraced, and then erased. It all began on April 20, 1933, Hitler's birthday. At his mountain retreat in Obersalzberg, in the early days of his rise to power, he stepped outside to greet a small crowd of admirers. There were no armored vehicles. No men in black uniforms flanking his every move. Just people, ordinary German citizens, hoping to see the new chancellor. One of them was a 6-year-old girl. Her name was Bernile Nienau. She had blonde curls, delicate features, and that innocent joy children seem to carry so effortlessly. Her mother happened to mention to Hitler that Bernile shared his birthday. A small detail. A coincidence. But for reasons no one ever fully understood, that single moment changed everything. Hitler invited the mother and child past the gates, into his home. And almost instantly a photograph was taken. Hitler smiling beside Bernile, his arm resting behind her. It wasn't staged. It wasn't stiff. It was warm, almost affectionate. A man who would become synonymous with hate, seen here, gently interacting with a little girl. That image was printed in magazines and newspapers across Germany. Shared in propaganda books. Reproduced by the thousands. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, recognized the emotional power of the scene immediately. It was perfect for the story the regime wanted to tell, a kind, paternal leader who loved his people, especially the children. And Bernile? She looked exactly like the regime's ideal, blonde, fair-skinned, innocent. But there was something beneath the surface. Something almost no one knew. Bernile's maternal grandmother had been born Jewish. And under the definitions soon to be written into Nazi law, that meant Bernile was considered non-Aryan. Not fully German. A Mischling. A person of mixed blood. In other words, the child standing next to Adolf Hitler, in one of the most iconic propaganda photos of his early rule, was Jewish by Nazi definition. And yet, the relationship continued. 4 years after that birthday meeting, Bernile and her mother were invited back to Hitler's mountain home. They wrote letters, dozens of them. Some still exist. In them, Bernile called Hitler affectionate names, shared stories, even sent him handmade gifts. To her, he was a friend. A kind man. Maybe even a father figure. To Hitler, the letters were accepted. The visits continued. And the photos kept coming. Behind closed doors, though, the truth was creeping closer. His aides had known since 1933. Some raised concerns. Quietly. Carefully. But Hitler ignored them. Or maybe he chose to. Why would a man so obsessed with racial purity openly maintain a friendship with a child who, by the rules of his own ideology, was not pure? That's the paradox. The haunting contradiction. As the Nazi racial laws solidified in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, things began to change. These laws didn't define Jewishness by faith. They defined it by ancestry. You could be Catholic. You could be a practicing Christian. It didn't matter. If your grandparents were Jewish, that label followed you. And with that label came exclusion, loss of rights, persecution, isolation. And yet, Bernile remained in the frame. Literally. Her photos with Hitler kept circulating, even as the regime targeted other children just like her. But the clock was ticking. By the late 1930s, Hitler's inner circle began to see the risk. Publicly embracing a child of Jewish descent, especially in such a high-profile way, was no longer tolerable. Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's most fanatical and rigid enforcers, finally intervened. He cut the cord. There was no grand announcement. No explanation. Just silence. Bernile and her mother were quietly told they could no longer visit. Letters stopped. Invitations vanished. And her image was gradually removed from new propaganda publications. Even Hoffmann, who had immortalized the relationship, was pressured to stop using her photos. The regime was rewriting its own story. Editing the parts that no longer fit. And so, a little girl who had once been called the Führer's child, was erased, not just from Hitler's life, but from the official history the Nazis were crafting. But her story didn't disappear forever. Years later, historians would stumble upon the letters, the photographs, the small details that told a bigger truth. And in early 2025, after years of speculation, researchers found documented proof in the Berlin Federal Archives. Hitler had been informed of Bernile's Jewish ancestry, explicitly, as early as 1933. He knew. And he chose to keep her close anyway. That revelation sent shockwaves through the academic world. Because it shattered one of the core myths about Hitler's ideology, that it was absolute, unwavering, consistent. It wasn't. It was flexible, selective, and disturbingly personal. This friendship with Bernile wasn't just a fluke. It was a crack in the mask. Was it sentimentality? Was she a tool he thought he could use? Was it genuine affection? We may never know. But what we do know is this. The relationship exposes the hypocrisy and human contradictions at the heart of a man who claimed to believe in racial purity above all else, and yet made exceptions even as others died for less. Bernile's story reminds us that history isn't clean. It's not always logical. It's made of people, flawed, contradictory, and sometimes frightening in their inconsistency. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all. We must study the uncomfortable truths. Not just the headlines or the slogans, but the in-between moments, the quiet hypocrisies, the friendships that shouldn't have existed. Because it's there, in the gray space, that we truly understand the dangers of blind ideology. But animals were just one piece of the puzzle. The most effective emotional tool the Nazis used, knowingly and repeatedly, was children. Children carry powerful symbolic weight. They represent innocence, purity, the future. And in a regime built on the illusion of moral righteousness and racial destiny, nothing communicated those ideals more effectively than images of Hitler with children. And that's why the relationship with Bernile Nienau, as quiet as it may have seemed, became so dangerous. To the public she was just another child Hitler doted on. A smiling little girl with bows in her hair and a hand-knitted gift for the Führer. To the propaganda ministry she was gold. The photos made headlines, appeared in magazines, were hung on walls. But internally, privately, the truth about her ancestry triggered a slow-motion panic. Because for a regime obsessed with bloodlines, the public image of Hitler lovingly embracing someone who would be categorized as Jewish under their own laws wasn't just uncomfortable. It was explosive. This contradiction began to unravel the illusion that Hitler was infallible. Because even if the average German never learned the truth, the people closest to him did. Bormann knew. Hoffmann knew. The adjutants and secretaries who read and delivered Bernile's letters knew. And while some remained quiet, others pushed back. Not to protect the child, but to protect the illusion. That's the truly devastating part. The party didn't remove Bernile because they suddenly realized she was at risk. They removed her because her existence risked exposing how hollow their ideology truly was. In many ways, Bernile's story reveals the hypocrisy at the core of Hitler's image. This was a regime that claimed to be uncompromising in its pursuit of racial purity, yet the man who gave it voice and power had knowingly and repeatedly violated that very principle in his private life. For 5 years he allowed a Jewish child, however distantly descended, to remain near him, to write to him, to appear beside him in official images. And when that became politically inconvenient, she wasn't protected. She was erased. The decision to cut her off, to withdraw the photos, to pretend the relationship had never existed, it wasn't just about silencing a potential scandal. It was about preserving a myth. And that myth required absolute control over the narrative. That's why the Nazi propaganda machine was so relentless. Every word, every photo, every headline was part of a broader project. To shape how Hitler would be remembered, to eliminate doubt, and to suppress any detail that could fracture the carefully built image. It's important to understand that this wasn't unusual for the regime. The Nazis routinely rewrote history in real time. If someone became politically inconvenient, even someone who had once been celebrated, they were quietly removed from public life. Photos were edited. Documents were burned. Names were struck from records. Bernile was just one among many. But what makes her story so unique, so gut-wrenching, is how deeply personal it was, how closely it touched the man at the center of it all. Because even with all his power, all his control, Hitler was still bound by the ideology he had created. He may have wanted to keep Bernile in his life. He may have genuinely felt affection for her. But he also knew the truth, that to allow her presence was to admit that race was not destiny. That a quarter Jewish girl could be every bit as loving, as loyal, as German as any child born of so-called pure blood. And that was unacceptable. That one quiet truth had the potential to topple an entire worldview built on lies. So Bernile disappeared from the Berghof. Her photos were shelved. Her name faded from the papers. And history moved on, but not without her. Today we look back at those photographs and see something the regime tried desperately to conceal. Not just a child. Not just a contradiction. But a human face behind the propaganda. A reminder that even in the darkest systems, humanity has a way of slipping through the cracks. And when it does, it leaves behind a truth that no amount of censorship can erase. That's why her story matters. Not just as a footnote, not just as a curiosity, but as a window into the mind of one of history's most dangerous leaders. Adolf Hitler didn't just lead a genocide. He built a worldview so rigid, so inhuman, that even a single photograph of a smiling child could threaten to unravel it. And when it did, the solution wasn't compassion. It was erasure. That's the kind of regime he built. One where innocence wasn't protected but buried, all to preserve a fantasy. As we reflect on this history, we must remember, images can lie. Smiles can deceive. Propaganda can wear the mask of kindness. The same hands that waved to children could sign orders for deportation. The same man who smiled beside Bernile would later orchestrate the deaths of over 1 million children in the Holocaust, many of whom looked just like her. That's the danger of illusions. They make it easier to believe that evil can look harmless. They invite us to trust what we want to see rather than what lies beneath. So if this story moved you, if it made you think about how history is shaped, and how truth can be buried under images, then don't let it fade. Share it. Talk about it. Tell others. Because the lessons of Bernile Nienau's life, and erasure, go far beyond one child or one dictator. They remind us how power uses perception, how prejudice is justified with lies, and how even a single contradiction left exposed can be revolutionary. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing to this channel. We'll continue to bring you stories like this, stories that challenge what we think we know and give voice to the forgotten moments of history. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Hitler's real motivations were? Could he have truly cared for the child, or was it all for show? Let's keep this conversation alive. Because history is never just about the past, it's a mirror held up to who we are right now. Of all the elements used to humanize Adolf Hitler, few were more effective, or more emotionally manipulative, than the inclusion of children. Hitler understood, perhaps instinctively, that being seen with children softened his image. It made him appear trustworthy, fatherly, approachable. When children smiled around him, when they reached for his hand or gazed at him with admiration, the photographs captured something far more powerful than mere affection. They captured the illusion of moral legitimacy. These moments were not spontaneous nor accidental. They were carefully arranged and curated, often by Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer and one of the key architects of the Führer's public image. Hoffmann knew what the camera could do. A single image of Hitler kneeling to greet a child or handing out sweets during a Christmas visit could undo, in the public imagination, the harsher realities of his policies. These children were often the sons and daughters of loyal party officials or household staff, individuals carefully chosen to ensure the optics remained ideologically pure. Whether it was Hitler ruffling the hair of Bormann's boys, standing at ease with the Goebbels' daughters, or strolling through a garden path with his arm around a child's shoulders, the message was always the same. Here was a man of warmth, a man who loved children, a leader the public could trust. And that's where the Berghof entered the scene. Perched in the Bavarian Alps, the Berghof was no ordinary residence. It was a theater of power and performance. Built to evoke serenity and natural beauty, it was staged like a movie set. Sunlight poured through tall windows. Carefully arranged flower beds lined the walkways. Guests arrived and departed on carefully timed schedules, and the architecture itself framed Hitler in soft, pastoral light. This was no accident. Everything, from the cushions on the chairs to the slope of the terrace, was curated to reinforce the image of a thoughtful man, a calm presence, someone who sought peace in nature while bearing the weight of a nation's future. To the outside world, the Berghof appeared to be a refuge, but in truth, it was a meticulously controlled propaganda instrument. Journalists who visited were given a show. Tea would be poured. Polite conversations had. Photos snapped. Hitler might be seen petting his German shepherd, Blondie, or watching a sunset with a guest on the balcony. It all reinforced the illusion. Here was no monster but a cultured gentleman, a thinker, a man of depth and sincerity. Even Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, played a quiet role in this narrative. Though their relationship was kept officially hidden, Braun captured hours of candid footage on her personal cine camera, scenes of Hitler walking through snow, eating simple meals or chatting with friends. These home videos weren't intended for public viewing, but they contributed nonetheless to the internal myth. They made Hitler appear relatable and, in some strange way, human. But for all the planning, all the careful curation, there was a crack in the image. A crack shaped like a child. Bernile Nienau had not been selected by the regime's inner circle. She had not been assigned to the Führer by any public relations team. Their connection began almost accidentally. In 1933, at a public gathering to celebrate Hitler's birthday, young Bernile pushed through the crowd with her mother to offer him flowers. Something about her moved him. Perhaps it was her composure, or her soft features, or the innocence she radiated. She had bright blonde hair and pale eyes. She was polite, grateful. And she looked, almost uncannily, like the poster child of Aryan purity. Hitler took to her instantly. Their meeting led to photographs, dozens of them, taken by Hoffmann, who quickly realized the PR potential of the encounter. These weren't just charming snapshots. They were published in official propaganda materials, showing a loving bond between the Führer and a sweet, adoring child. Readers were told she had become close to Hitler, even sending him letters and homemade gifts. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Bernile was the daughter of the Reich, a symbol of youthful loyalty and national unity. The illusion was perfect. Behind the camera, a truth lingered that threatened to unravel everything. Bernile was not the child of Nazi officials. She wasn't part of the elite. And she certainly wasn't Aryan. Unknown to most at the time, but fully documented in her family records, Bernile's maternal grandmother had been born Jewish. Though she later converted to Catholicism, the Nazi regime didn't recognize religious conversion. Ancestry, not faith, defined your status. And according to the racial ideology that had been codified into law by the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, that meant Bernile's mother was classified as a Mischling of the first degree, half Jewish, and Bernile herself was a Mischling of the second degree, 1/4 Jewish. Under Nazi policy, this rendered her racially impure. Initially, this fact was either unknown or quietly ignored. After all, she fit the image perfectly. But as the regime's policies tightened and its ideological purity became more aggressive, the contradiction became untenable. A quarter Jewish child being publicly embraced by Hitler? That couldn't stand. It was more than a liability, it was a direct threat to the racial myth the regime had spent years building. Martin Bormann, Hitler's chief private secretary, saw the danger immediately. Known for his cold, bureaucratic loyalty to Nazi principles, Bormann had no patience for sentiment. He wasn't interested in public affection or political optics. What mattered to him was ideological consistency. Once he became aware of Bernile's ancestry, he acted swiftly and without hesitation. He banned her and her mother from visiting the Berghof. All correspondence was halted. No further photographs were to be published. Existing ones were quietly withdrawn from circulation, and efforts were made, some successful, some not, to scrub her from the historical record. Even Hoffmann, who had helped elevate Bernile to national prominence through his photographs, was ordered to stop using her image. According to later accounts, Bormann even pressured Hoffmann to destroy the original negatives, an act of erasure meant to ensure that this contradiction would disappear entirely. But some copies survived, hidden in private albums or already distributed across the Reich. And because of that, the illusion was never fully destroyed. What did Hitler say about this? According to Hoffmann's memoirs, the Führer was disappointed. Not because of the racial implications, but because he had enjoyed the child's affection. There are people, Hitler is reported to have said, who have a positive genius for spoiling all my little pleasures. It was a revealing remark. He didn't protest. He didn't overrule Bormann. He simply accepted the loss, however regretfully. The system he built, the ideology he enforced, had now turned inward. Not even he could shield himself from it. And that's what makes the story of Bernile Nienau so striking. She did nothing wrong. She wasn't outspoken. She didn't rebel. She didn't question the regime. She smiled, she wrote letters, she believed in the man she called Uncle Hitler. But her bloodline made her unacceptable. Her very existence in the public eye endangered the Nazi fantasy of racial clarity. She had to be removed not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, a living contradiction to the lie at the heart of Nazi ideology. What's chilling is how easily this erasure occurred. No announcement was made. No explanation offered. The visit simply stopped. Her image disappeared from the pages of official publications. For most Germans, she was forgotten, her memory overwritten by other, more acceptable images. But behind the silence, the logic of the regime revealed itself. It wasn't enough to control people's actions or beliefs. It wanted to control their identities. And when someone didn't fit, no matter how beloved, they were cast out. Even the law, which might have offered some form of appeal or nuance, was brutally simple. In Nazi Germany, it didn't matter if you were raised Christian or never entered a synagogue. If your grandparents were Jewish, then you were Jewish. You carried the stain of your lineage like an invisible mark. And no amount of affection, loyalty, or usefulness could erase it. Not even the affection of the Führer. Bernile's story endures because it exposes the fragility of the Nazi myth. The regime prided itself on order, clarity, and ideological strength, but it couldn't reconcile itself with a single child. A child who looked like everything it claimed to value, but who by its own laws could never belong. And so she was erased, not for what she had done but for what she reminded them of. That identity is not so easily categorized, that humanity resists simplification, and that every system built on lies eventually finds the one truth it cannot hide. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about history, don't keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more untold and deeply human stories from the past. Let's keep the conversation going, because history only teaches us when we're willing to look at it honestly.